Hey there, stranger. Thank you for tuning in to the Keto Answers podcast. I am your host, Dr. Anthony Gustin, and this week joining me is Max Lugavere. Max has a pretty crazy story that he shares with us on the podcast today. He chats about how he had a family member go through a neurodegenerative disease where he felt helpless, so basically dedicated his entire life to research and why this stuff happens. To no surprise, he found that the nutrition was a huge cause, and so we chatted about tons of different stuff about how you can use a ketogenic diet for brain health. And it's one of these conversations that I learn a ton every time I talk to Max, and this time was no exception. So I hope you guys learn something new and enjoy the show. Before we get to the episode, I wanted to chat about our sponsor, Perfect Keto. Perfect Keto is all about making a ketogenic diet healthy and accessible. Whether you're reading all of our online guides or articles or enjoying Perfect Keto's exogenous ketones or any other keto-friendly products, everything you need to make keto work for you is at perfectketo.com. I know what you're thinking. Hey, aren't you the founder of Perfect Keto? Yep, that's right. And all of my insanely high standards have been put into making each and every product. My background as a functional medicine clinician helps me craft the cleanest and healthiest possible products and best information about a ketogenic diet. Head on over to perfectketo.com to learn anything you need to know about the ketogenic diet. And if you've never tried any of our products before, feel free to use the code KETOPODCAST for 20% off your first order. With that being said, let's get into the show. All right, Max.
Hey.
Thanks for being on the show, man.
That's it? We're rolling?
Yeah.
Cool.
Ready to go. You were like the king of tidbits and like most digestible information. Like every time I go to your Instagram page, like, oh, there's 4 things I didn't know. I don't know if you've honed this with, I mean, you do a lot of stuff like with on the Dr. Oz show, things like that. You're obviously very passionate about nutrition. Like what's the story here? Like, where did you get started? I know you did a documentary before, all this different stuff. What does the path look like for you to be where you're at and care about nutrition so much?
Good question. I've actually always cared about nutrition. It's been a lifelong passion of mine. I kind of attribute it sometimes to my love of, confluence of things. The fact that I was an introverted computer nerd programmer growing up. I got no attention from ladies all throughout high school, and I gravitated to computers and sort of analytical thinking and design. And at a certain point, I think that collided with my passion for comic books and superheroes and my desire to actually be a superhero. And one day I was like walking around in Chelsea, where I went to high school in Manhattan, and I stumbled into a supplement store. And this is all going to make sense in a minute. It sounds pretty random, but it was basically a mom and pop supplement store. And there was a guy behind the counter who was always there, and he was like really knowledgeable. And something clicked in my brain where I saw the supplements on the counter as being magical potions that had the potential to turn me into something greater than what I was in high school as this introverted computer programmer at braces. And I just, I kind of gravitated to exercise and specifically bodybuilding at a very young age. Not that I ever wanted to be a bodybuilder, but I just really, what I found was that the same feedback loops that were present in programming were also there in fitness. You know, you have the ability to debug health problems, to tweak and iterate and streamline. And this, applied to what you were doing in the gym. It also applied to what you were doing with your diet. And also I became like really interested in supplements. And so anyway, so that was like a lifelong passion. I ended up...
What supplements did you start with? This is as a male, same age group, I went through this same exact thing.
Yeah.
And it's always funny to see like where people start and like what kind of garbage stuff they put in their body. Like, oh, okay, I look back 10 years, like terrible decision. Like what were the top ones that
we might have even read the same book at that age, because one of the first books that I got my hands on, I didn't know it at the time, but it was a huge marketing tome for Body for Life. But it was basically that was the name of the book. It was called Body for Life by Bill Phillips, and it was basically it was a huge encyclopedia about supplements, creatine, HMB, all this stuff. But it was put out by EAS, which is a huge supplement company, and it was all basically promoting its own supplements. But nonetheless, I found it to be really, really fascinating. So I guess at first I was really into... I actually gravitated to creatine. I thought creatine was really cool, and lots of really solid evidence behind it. And I actually wrote my senior thesis in high school about creatine. It was like a 12-page.
So I did in my master's program. So I get my doctorate and my master's congruently, and for the master's, you needed to do a thesis type of project as well. It was also about research of creatine.
Wow, yeah, that's awesome. Dude.
I'm sure we can nerd out about that for a while.
Two peas in a pod.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is very effective. It's backed up by a lot of research. It's
Yes.
like there's a lot of great reasons why one would use it. And so like these are one of the ingredients back then. It's like, oh shit, they were right. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Cool. So creatine.
Yeah. So creatine. And interestingly, I've sort of come full circle with my interest in creatine. But I had this love for science and health, but academically, I always struggled with what I now know are executive abilities all throughout my schooling. I struggled to get good grades. I was always in the honors program. I was always considered intellectually gifted by my teachers, but I always struggled to get good grades, and I never actually got them. I attribute it to, a myriad of things, but I think that just our learning styles are all different. And, many of us suffer because we're sort of funneled through this one-size-fits-all educational paradigm. And that's unfortunate because it ended up with me actually not going to medical school and instead developing a love for creativity and art. And I ended up going to University of Miami and studying film and psychology. That ended up with me, I made a film as an undergraduate that it was a documentary that ended up with me getting a dream job where I ended up moving out to Los Angeles and working for Al Gore for 5 years, hosting a TV network that he created called Current TV. And that was a really cool job to immerse myself in for that period of time. It was sort of like grad school for journalism. I got to work with some of the best storytellers in the world, Peabody Award-winning journalists. The network won an Emmy. I had the perks of being on camera, but always being associated with this network with a higher calling. I've always really been passionate about telling stories that I felt were important and undertold. And that's what Current was all about. So for me, it was like a perfect fit. And my interests there, I was still very much interested in health, and I tried to squeeze that into what I was talking about on air as much as I could, even though what I ended up actually covering on Current ran the gamut. But when I left that job to try to figure out where I was going to go with my life and my career, it was around 2011 that my mother started to show the very earliest signs of memory loss. And my mom was 58 at the time. She was spirited, fast walking, fast talking New Yorker, blonde, somebody who really was in the prime of her life. And it had seemed as though her brain's processing speed had suddenly downshifted. It was very apparent. And in tandem with that, her gait had changed. The way that she walked had changed. Now, obviously today I know about Parkinson's. I mean, I know about the broad array of neurodegenerative conditions, and I'm considered by many people to be an expert, even though I don't ever use that term for myself, because I don't think that you can truly be an expert in something as complicated as Alzheimer's disease, let alone the brain,
right?
Which is this. We know more about space than we know about the human brain. Nonetheless, back then I was completely mystified, and I couldn't make the connection between the brain and movement. I thought that maybe she just needed to get to the gym more, do a little bit of stretching. It was a really strange time. I was in between jobs, so it gave me the ability to go with my mom to various doctor's appointments. We began in New York, where she lives. I was spending more and more time in New York, so we were at NYU. We visited Columbia. In every instance, it was what I've come to call diagnose and adios. Although in those early days with my mom, we weren't even able to get a diagnosis. It was so nebulous as to, what my mom might have had. And then we started to broaden out the search for answers. I distinctly remember going to the U.S. News and World Report's website and trying to find the best neurology departments in the United States, because we were in New York, couldn't find answers there. We had to go. I was looking at the Mayo Clinic, the Cleveland Clinic. We ended up going to Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, which has a great neurology department. We still weren't able to find a diagnosis. And the journey really, at least for me, culminated at a trip to the Cleveland Clinic, where the Cleveland Clinic, before the term functional medicine was in my lexicon, what I heard about the Cleveland Clinic was that they were, unlike the way most doctors' visits unfold, they basically assemble a team around a patient when they have, in particular, when they have complex medical cases. They'll bring an endocrinologist into the room, a neurologist, a gastroenterologist to see what's going on. Because my mom had this confluence of strange symptoms. And it was there for the first time that my mom was diagnosed with a neurodegenerative disease. And even there, in that storied cathedral to human achievement, the Cleveland Clinic, right? Like the top, one of the top hospitals in the United States, right? I experienced the same thing there, where a doctor basically spent 15 minutes with my mom, ran a battery of very strange cognitive tests and physical tests, not really explaining a whole lot, never once mentioning diet or lifestyle or anything like that, and then sending us on our way essentially with two prescriptions for two drugs, one for Parkinson's disease and one for Alzheimer's disease.
So they're just guessing at this point, as far as
it seemed clear that she had a Parkinsonian syndrome, but exactly what variant of dementia was unclear.
Okay. Can you explain for people who are not aware of the differences between these two?
Yeah. So there are movement disorders and there are memory disorders. The most common movement disorder is known as Parkinson's disease. And in pop culture, Michael J. Fox is probably the most well-known person with Parkinson's disease. It essentially affects movement. It involves a part of the brain called the substantia nigra, which has dopaminergic neurons in it that control movement. And what happens in Parkinson's disease is that those neurons begin to die, and it affects how a person moves. So some of the most common features of Parkinson's disease are rigidity, stiffness, tremor, a gait that changes. Patients with Parkinson's disease tend to shuffle. And actually, one of the lesser appreciated symptoms of Parkinson's disease is constipation and GI dysfunction.
And so that would just be because you have motility issues in your intestines, correct?
Yeah, although there's really, it's unclear as to the etiology, what right. causes Parkinson's disease is unknown, but there is a really interesting link between gut health and Parkinson's disease. They did a really interesting study where patients that underwent a procedure where their vagus nerve got severed over, I forget the period of time, but it was a significant period of time where they actually had a 50% risk reduction of developing Parkinson's disease. Yeah. Suggesting that whatever causes that disease to develop begins in the gut, travels up the vagus nerve, and enters the brain. So that's a movement disorder. And then if you have movement symptoms, they might say that it's a Parkinson's plus. If you have other, maybe memory symptoms, or it's a Parkinsonian disease. Lewy body dementia is an example of a Parkinson's-like disease. It has very similar pathology as Parkinson's disease, but it also has memory dysfunction. Robin Williams, it was revealed that he was diagnosed with Lewy body dementia before he killed himself. Lewy body dementia is horrible. It feels like having both Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease at the same time. And it's sort of a niche form of dementia. It affects about 1 million people in the United States. I believe Parkinson's disease affects 2, possibly. And then the hallmark memory disorder is Alzheimer's disease, which affects 5 million people in the United States. So it's a very common disease. Today, if you make it to the age of 85, you have a 50% chance of being diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. So just flip a coin, and those are your odds, essentially. And Alzheimer's disease is a memory disorder. It affects mostly women. 2/3 of Alzheimer's patients are women, but everybody is vulnerable. Many people believe that it's a hereditary condition, but only 2 to 3% of Alzheimer's cases are hereditary because there's a variant. It's a rare form of Alzheimer's disease called early onset familial Alzheimer's disease. The vast majority of people develop what's called late onset Alzheimer's disease. And that is not genetically determined. So there are genetic risk factors, but you can easily not have one of those genetic risk factors and develop Alzheimer's disease. Although if you do have one of the risk factors, genetically speaking, it's the most well-defined Alzheimer's risk gene is the ApoE4 allele. If you carry one copy, you inherit a variant of the ApoE gene from your mom and your dad. there's 3 different variants of it. There's ApoE2, ApoE3, ApoE4. If you inherit one ApoE4 copy, you have double the relative risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. If you inherited 2 copies, which is more rare, you have a 14-fold increased risk. But genes are not destiny, as we know. You can look at other parts of the world, like Ibadan, Nigeria, for example, where the ApoE4 frequency actually is very high, and it has little to no association with Alzheimer's disease.
Right.
So what that actually suggests, which I think is fascinating, is if you are a genetic risk in the United States, you live in the United States and you have the ApoE4 allele, you're at genetic risk. You can essentially move to Nigeria and adopt their diet and lifestyle and see your risk potentially be abolished.
Right. And so this is one of the things about all this gene research that's coming out right now, is that what I've heard is, and that I didn't make this up, but genes essentially like load a gun, but environment and lifestyle pulls a trigger and determines what happens with that.
Yeah.
And so you guys were given this vague diagnosis and just medications. And like, I think this is a problem as well about like figuring out what's going on, is that we're never asking, and this is why I went to the chiropractic route instead of an MD route, is that everyone in that field in like Western medicine, especially at the time when I was making this decision, was that, okay, you have a problem. How do we stop that problem, instead of asking like, why did that problem happen in the first place? Like, it's analogous to like, if you're in a room with a fire alarm going on, like you're like, should we fan out the smoke from the fire alarm? Should we bust it so it doesn't work? Should we take out the batteries? Should we cover it up? What are we doing? Like, no, there's a fire here.
Yeah.
What started that fire, and how do we put that out?
Exactly.
You know what I mean? And so is that like a point of frustration that you guys had? Like did you discover that? I know that a lot of times people like, it just isn't clear that that's the framework that a lot of medicine is working on until they figure it out on their own. I think that's really unfortunate.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, I've always had that bias towards nutrition being this powerful tool that dictates not only how your body feels, but, you know, my intuition was that it affected your predilection for disease. And that was my hunch. I didn't have any, you know, obviously I didn't have a background in medicine. I didn't, you know, it's just something that I decided from one day to the next to begin to research. And I also, you know, it seemed to me very strange that dementia, up until the point at which my mom started to show these symptoms, was not in my vocabulary. Like, I had no prior family history of dementia, which to me, like, at the same time that my mom was that I was with my mom in Cleveland getting this diagnosis, my grandmother, who's now deceased, but she was alive at the time, was in New York. At the age of 96, she was cognitively sharper than my mother, her daughter. Right. So to me, that was a very clear, a very clear piece of evidence that there was something that changed between my grandmother's and my mom's generation that essentially led to my mom being poisoned by the world around her. I didn't know what that was, and I sort of went into my research with an open mind. What I found has really become the basis for what I think, you know, I mean, what clearly is my life's work. I mean, I've become very passionate about spreading this message to people of all ages. I mean, one of the most shocking things that I learned is that most dementias, you know, dementia many times begins in the brain decades before the first symptom. So you take Alzheimer's disease, it begins in the brain 30 to 40 years before the first symptom. Parkinson's disease, by the time you show your very first symptom of Parkinson's disease, 50% of the dopaminergic neurons involved in movement in the part of the brain affected by Parkinson's disease are already dead.
Right.
So I was just like, wow, I used to think of Alzheimer's disease and dementia and all this stuff as being conditions only old people needed to worry about. I was wrong. This is something that, I mean, millennials, the oldest millennial is now approaching 40. Like, this is something that we really need to be talking about. I'm not just talking about millennials as caregivers for their parents. No, I'm talking about like our own cognitive fate. You know, it's literally what we're talking about. That's what's on the table. And I think, you know, if we are able to live in a way that sort of mimics the environment and the diet and the lifestyle that we had during the time in which our brains evolved, I think, you know, we're probably going to be better served.
Right. So you had this journey when you started pulling the thread, and what was the difference between the lifestyle between my grandmother and my mother? What were the first things that you started realizing? They were like, okay, I need to dig further. I need to dig further.
Yeah. Well, I think, I definitely, I started looking at, I guess I started, at the top from a bird's eye view, just looking at dietary patterns that were associated with better neurological and vascular health. To me, it made perfect sense from the get-go that vascular health would weigh in heavily on neurological health. One of the problems with Western medicine, which I'm sure you talk about all the time, is that medicine is a vast field, and it often takes a reductionist approach to health. Mm-hmm. You've got the neurologist looking at the brain, you've got the GI looking at the gut. Nutrition is really never a conversation had in those rooms. And, amid these vast silos, it's just, it takes a level of creative thinking to, I think, connect those dots. And very few doctors, I think, are able to. And so I started to look at, the things that were related to vascular health. I started to, dive into fat and cholesterol, because my mom actually, not that I really was ever, fully made aware of this, because he died when I was very young, but I think we might have had a family history of heart disease. And this is one of the reasons that my mom was always very afraid of fat. So growing up, we had corn oil in my house. I never saw my mom eating eggs. We always had margarine, never butter. And these are foods that I know now are highly unhealthy. But at the time, we thought they were the exact opposite. We thought that they were actually healthy. So for a woman that was trying to be at her most healthy, to avoid heart disease, to be fed these industrial products, I think is one of the causative factors in what my mom ultimately developed. So I started looking at fat, looking at cholesterol, looking at the dietary recommendations over the past 50 years. The notion that to attain health, we've got to eat 6 to 11 servings of grains per day. Today, I don't eat that number of that serving of grains in a week, or maybe even a month. I started looking at, the role of saturated fat in heart disease. I began looking into the necessity of, or I guess how to properly feed the brain. So I started with macronutrients. I think it became pretty clear to me that protein is obviously essential. There's actually the protein leverage hypothesis is very interesting to me. The notion that we basically eat until we get enough protein, and that's why protein is the most satiating macronutrient, more so than fat or carbs. And fat obviously made a lot of sense to me, was very important, both in terms of making some of the most important nutrients in our produce more bioavailable, but also because the brain is largely constructed of fat. So, how could fat possibly, as a whole, be bad for us? Obviously, when you look into the different kinds of fats, I think there's nuance to that discussion, which is actually very important now that people are like all about these super high fat diets. But I realized that really the brain, in terms of an exogenous glucose requirement, the brain doesn't really have one. The body can turn, is a incredibly elegant mobile biochemistry lab that can turn, that can basically, use a myriad of fuels when glucose ceases to be available in the diet. And glucose wasn't always available for the vast majority of our evolution. So. Right. A lot of people think that grains and also just carbohydrates in general are essential to health, and they're not actually. So I started looking at like modern food products and modern dietary constructs, breakfast and things like that. Rather than just accept that we need these things at face value, I started to paint everything in the diet with, I started to paint everything as being guilty until proven innocent. I think too often today we assume that these modern products and foods and constructs are innocent until we're able to prove them guilty. But that hasn't really served us well in the past, right? So, yeah, it was a lot. I mean, I started looking into the Mediterranean dietary pattern, which, is an eating pattern that's based on epidemiology. So I started to look at like what are probably the most effective aspects of that diet, and which aspects of the diet are maybe just noise. So for example, like grains are commonly cited as being a part of the Mediterranean diet. But based on my research, I believe that the Mediterranean diet is healthy in spite of grains, not because of grains.
Right.
So yeah, it's just been, it's been a lot. There's also a huge lifestyle component to it. I think diet though plays a major role. And I think it's one of those areas where people have a lot of confusion. Anybody these days can just put up content on Instagram or wherever and amass a huge following. And, I use Instagram as a communication tool, but I think now more than ever, it's so important to be responsible in your messaging. And so, yeah, that's kind of like what my mission has become.
Yeah. So when you started learning about all that stuff, did you guys start implementing that? Did you implement some stuff yourself? Was it for your mom only? Like how did that work? And what were those changes like over the discovery point until now?
Yeah. So, I definitely tried to, once I came back from the mountaintop with all these like new insights in tow, I think the first thing I tried to do is to put my mom on a ketogenic diet. At the time, there was not a lot of evidence on...
And when was this?
This was 2011.
Okay.
So I think the only study that really was... so back then, I think there was one study, and I've since become friends with the researcher who led it, on patients with mild cognitive impairment using a ketogenic dietary intervention. And they found that in patients with this sort of what's often considered pre-dementia, that it actually improved cognitive function in these patients with cognitive impairment. And now, I think 2 weeks ago, it was published for the first time, a ketogenic dietary intervention was tested in patients with mild and moderate Alzheimer's disease. I also became familiar very early on, which I think a lot of people do when they're really sort of entering this space and they start digging around on the internet. I came across the work of Mary Newport, who is a physician based in Florida who started blogging about her husband, her late husband Steve, developed Alzheimer's disease and was pretty far along in his disease when Mary very intuitively decided to, based on a press release that she discovered for an FDA food product that was coming to market, she decided to give her husband coconut oil, which is very high in medium chain triglycerides. And the idea is that for a brain with Alzheimer's disease, its ability to use glucose and to convert glucose to the energetic currency of cells, ATP, is diminished by 45%.
Right. And so this is where I think that some stuff too is like coming out that says Alzheimer's is essentially like diabetes type 3.
Yes.
Where it's just your body's inability to use glucose properly.
Yeah.
And so obviously if you use a diet based upon high MCT oil, stuff like this that can transfer into the blood-brain barrier and through that and use for fuel, that is just an alternative fuel source.
Yeah, so essentially it basically is like a push of ketones into the brain. And Mary was one of the sort of earliest pioneers for this, actually. And huge early inspiration for me. And I came across her work. So with my mom in those early days, I was like, okay, Mom, we got to stock up on coconut oil and get rid of all the carbs. And I tried really hard to get my mom to adhere to that diet. And I think she did it for about 2 weeks. But at the end of the day, it was really difficult for her to stay on. I can't say that I saw a major improvement in her cognitive function over that 2 week period. But mostly what it was really difficult to get her to adhere to. So I'm not a caregiver for my mother. She has a home health aide, and these home health aides are not educated when it comes to nutrition. And also, when a person develops Alzheimer's disease, there's a shift in food preference occurs where they start to crave sweet foods. So adherence to a ketogenic style dietary intervention for a patient with dementia is very difficult. In fact, in the study that I just mentioned that was just published, I forget what journal it was published in, they did show a significant improvement in cognitive function when patients were able to adhere to the diet. But the more the disease progressed, the less able the patients were able to actually adhere to the diet. And in particular, it was a huge stressor on the caregivers.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I wonder if this is where people could use maybe compounds like non-nutritive sweeteners like stevia to maybe mimic a sweetness preference
Yeah.
to deliver really high fat foods with very low carbohydrate loads.
Yeah. That's a good idea. Yeah. I mean, I think it's ironic, right? Because I mean, those are the same high sugar foods, which basically it's theorized that that's sort of like the brain crying out for energy. But those are the exact same foods that essentially drive inflammation, especially in the modern supermarket. You know, you have a craving for carbs, you go to the modern supermarket. I mean, these are the exact kinds of foods that drive inflammation, promote peripheral insulin resistance, which is strongly related to brain glucose hypometabolism, which in English means that, you know, the more inflamed and insulin resistant you are in the body, which is what characterizes essentially so many of the modern chronic diseases, type 2 diabetes, prediabetes, obesity, that basically is strongly connected to a diminished ability to use of your brain to convert glucose to ATP. And so, yeah, so that's, again, you know, I think, so going back to your question, yeah, I tried as hard as I could, and at a certain point, I made the conscious decision to teach gently but step back, because I think ultimately people are going to live the way that they want to live. And I love my mom. At this point, she's the happiest when she's spending time with me and my two younger brothers. And I didn't want my neuroses over nutrition to get in the way of the quality time that I was spending with my mom. I mean, I would actually get like emotionally like upset when I would come over and I would see like a bag of chips out, you know, and it makes me sad, but you know, I don't want to police my mom. It's just not, she doesn't appreciate it. It makes me too upset. So, you know, I think she has changed her diet for the better. There's no more corn oil in her house, things like that. She's not really, you know, doing the whole coconut oil or MCT oil or exogenous ketone thing. There's no bread really in the house. I'm trying to get her to eat more eggs and things like that, which are, I call in the book, genius foods. Yeah, I mean, I really am dedicated to this notion of prevention. I think that once you have dementia, which again, oftentimes begins in the brain decades before the first symptom. I mean, that to me illustrates why Alzheimer's drug trials have a 99.6% fail rate.
Right.
It's just, this is a decades-long disease process. And by the time you see it emerge in the form of symptoms, it's the tip of the iceberg. You know, it's an iceberg, and literally what you're not seeing is this decades-long disease process.
And so did your research point to the fact that, like you said before, it's more of a peripheral insulin resistance as a cause that drives this? Is it like, obviously we're talking about industrial seed oils not being fantastic and things like processed foods, but like, what in your research has shown, like, okay, if I'm someone who's 20, 30 right now and I want to prevent this stuff from happening, did you were able to distill anything from that and be like, for sure avoid these things? Like this is maybe a causative element to dementia or some of these other disease states we were talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think one of the major problems in the Western world, first of all, it's the confluence of just ultra processed foods that now make up 60% of the calories consumed in the US. You know, our brains evolved under very unique conditions. We were hunter-gatherers. We ate from the land. The land was our buffet. You know, there are 50,000 edible plant species around the world. 10,000 years ago, our diets became based on 3 plants, which now make up the majority of our calories: rice, corn, and wheat. Mm-hmm. And these plants are energy dense, nutrient poor. Over time, our brains we essentially turned our backs on the diet that created the human brain. Mm-hmm. And over time, our brains shrank, losing the volumetric equivalent of a tennis ball.
Yeah, there's something like 10% since about 10,000 years ago.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and diet, I think, has a major role in that. It's also the fact that a hunter-gatherer had to be basically self-sufficient, whereas the post-agricultural world basically, relied on specialization. So once we became basically slaves to the crops that we could domesticate, there had to be one person to grow the wheat, one person to pick it, one person to bake it, one person to sell it. It basically gave rise to this notion of hyper specialization. But I think today, the fact that so many of us are struggling with attention deficit is sort of a hint to me that humans are not meant to be specialists. Well, not all of us, at least. There's this really great theory idea, and I talk about it a bit in Genius Foods, that the ADHD brain today, it might be a problem for somebody today trying to fit into a one-size-fits-all educational path or career, but that person actually might have been the ultimate badass hunter-gatherer, and I can certainly relate to that. I mean, that's why so many people with ADHD go into more entrepreneurial careers, and they're actually happier that way. I can certainly relate to that. But yeah, so going back, today we're just overindulging on these ultra processed foods. We're still eating grains with every meal. We're advised actually by our USDA MyPlate to include grains at every meal. When there's no good evidence to say that grains improve health, it's still being marketed to us as if we need them for good health. So, these dietary recommendations are not evidence-based. Your average American eats about 300 grams of carbohydrates per day.
That's insane.
It's nuts. I don't know if I eat 300 net grams of carbs in a week.
Right.
So what that's doing essentially is that it's keeping us with chronically elevated insulin levels. Chronically elevated insulin can precede a diagnosis of diabetes by a decade. And this is actually one of the major problems, chronically elevated insulin. Whether or not your blood sugar, whether or not your insulin resistance has gotten to the point where your blood sugar becomes chronically elevated, it's believed that 40% of Alzheimer's cases might be owed to chronically elevated insulin alone. And then when you get to the point where your blood sugar is chronically elevated, well, what that does is it causes inflammation in your blood vessels. It basically scorches your blood vessels, which is essential to deliver nutrients and fuel to your neurons. So it's a systemic problem. I think that the overindulgence of carbs is definitely part of it. I think the polyunsaturated grain and seed oils that promote inflammation in our blood vessels also, highly problematic. The canola oil, the corn oil, the soybean oil, the grapeseed oil. These are highly damaging.
So this is one of the things that really fires me up.
Yeah.
So for instance, they can be marketed as a healthy food because they're vegetable source, or they can be organic or things like that. Can you just touch briefly on what your research in this stuff has shown and why vegetable oils traditionally can be bad for somebody or inflammatory?
Yeah, they're all bad. So when we talk about vegetable oils are sort of like it's a term used to mask corn and soybean oil usually in packaged foods. These oils are chemically and often heat extracted from their whole food sources, and they're predominantly polyunsaturated fats. Polyunsaturated fats, throughout the vast majority of human evolution, were consumed in trace amounts in whole foods. So, for example, when we're talking about eating fatty fish to get your omega-3s, omega-3s are polyunsaturated fats, and we get them in relatively small quantities when we eat fatty fish. And consumption of fatty fish is related to larger brain volume and, reduced cognitive aging, better cardiovascular health. But today, whether we're talking omega-3s or omega-6s, these polyunsaturated oils are extracted from their whole foods, where the antioxidants that they're usually found bundled with are removed, and they're highly refined and processed and deodorized to the point where they now, first of all, the oils are inherently damaged by the time they make it to our kitchens. They're sold to us in bottles. They easily degrade due to light, heat, and oxygen exposure. They're usually already oxidized because these fats are so delicate. And then when we have them in our kitchens, I mean, we can have a bottle open for months in the warm kitchen environment, just further damaging the oil. The deodorization process to make sure that these oils are completely tasteless and odorless, which is why manufacturers actually happen to love them. They can squeeze them into every crevice of the food supply, actually creates trans fats. There's a great article on the Harvard School of Public Health's website by I think his name is Dr. Guy Crosby, where they basically have found up to 5% trans fats in, commonly sold canola oils that you can just buy in the supermarket. So even if you're you're trying hard to avoid trans fats, I mean, these oils naturally contain them. And today we're just over consuming them. I mean, they now make up 10% of the calories that we consume from polyunsaturated fats, whereas 100 years ago, they made up 0% of our calorie intake.
And this is one of the things too. It's like you try to make healthy decisions, but if you're not controlling the food, they sneak in anywhere and everywhere. It's like when I go out to eat at restaurants now, I'm starting to become that super annoying, needy guy who's like, well, what are you cooking that with?
Yeah.
Like, what's in that sauce? Or like, can I just get this like steamed vegetable and lean meat? Because I just question, like, they're so cheap and readily available to make things like sauces or to cook with that chances are if you go to eat and unless they're saying so on the menu that this is the oil we cook with, you can probably bet that they're using these damaging oils.
Absolutely. Yeah. They promote inflammation. They deplete your body of your own natural antioxidant defenses. They make your brain cell membranes more rigid, less able to respond to outside signals.
Right. And so this is a good point where like I always try to hit on is that your cells are made of fat. Yes. Like they have a phospholipid bilayer. And and this takes about, on an average cell, about 2 years to make a new cell, right? And so you're living with the choice of the fat you're eating for the next 2 years.
Yeah.
And so the quality of your cell is dependent on the quality of your food. And so what happens is when you start making that rigid, like you said, the communication between cells is disrupted and the actual performance of your body is then degraded. You have to require more work to get less things done. And so like it is a very important thing. Like that meal doesn't just end there. Like if you have a cheat meal or have a low quality fat, you incorporate that into your body and you have to then replace it eventually. And so this is the thing, like you have to on average like live with that meal for 2 years.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we talk about, I'm sure you talk on your podcast all the time about the value of mitochondrial health.
Right.
But I mean, mitochondria are inside of cells. To get to the mitochondria, you need to go through the phospholipid bilayer in the cell membrane.
Right.
And you want those membranes to be healthy. So that's actually, I mean, one of the first big scientific concepts that I talk about in Genius Foods is how to basically get the healthiest neuronal membranes. It's so important. I mean, your neuronal membranes, underneath these membranes lie the receptors for all the various neurotransmitters in your brain. These receptors need your cell membranes to possess the property of fluidity so they can bob up to the surface and receive the message from the neurotransmitter crossing the synaptic cleft. So for these membranes to have that property, it's all about the kinds of fats that you're eating. And just going back to where they're found, I mean, they're like ubiquitous. Their grain and bakery products are like the number one source of them in the modern diet. They're in commercial salad dressings. I say avoid commercial salad dressings like the plague. They literally varnish dried fruits that you buy even in Whole Foods. For example, like I tried the other day, I was like on the hunt for some tart cherries. I couldn't find them without being coated in sunflower oil.
Yeah. I mean, Whole Foods, if you're listening, like step up your game. I try to go to the hot bar and everything besides maybe one thing has canola oil in it. Like these things are snuck in everywhere, and like Whole Foods has a good mission. They're trying to do the right thing, but then we just have such an abundance of this that again, like it comes to I think a lot of different factors, but one that's cheap and one that's readily available and already used so much. Like a Kind bar, for example. Saw one on a plane the other day, and I looked at the marketing on it, like do good for your body, do good for the world, and I flipped it over, all these ingredients, and like 4 different types of vegetable oils.
Wow. I didn't know Kind bars were using those. I mean, I already know that there's more sugar. Like I wouldn't touch a Kind bar.
Right. But I mean, and this is where like marketing becomes very confusing for people who don't really understand how to read a nutrition label or really clear on the foods that are damaging to them, because the marketing message says like this is a healthy whole food.
Yeah.
And then you flip over the label, and if you've done like an extensive amount of research, like we have, like it takes a long time to start learning this stuff and then changing behavior patterns on it. And like now for us, it's like easy to look at a label and say like, okay, this is trash. But if you just look at it and it says like healthy for you, it's easy to trust that if you're not educated in this stuff.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it drives me nuts. I love to go to the supermarket and just look at marketing and call companies out on my Instagram.
Yeah.
I mean, one of all the products that I've taken down, one of the most offensive to me is by a company called Tofutti. It basically is this fake cream cheese substitute, and it's packaged as if it were healthy. I mean, it's like cholesterol free, gluten free, lactose free. The primary ingredient is hydrogenated soybean oil, and you look at the nutrition facts, and just a single serving has 2 grams of trans fat. It's pure trans fat. It's toxic. I mean, saturated fats are not, in the most recent meta-analysis that I've reviewed, not associated with an increase of all-cause mortality, which is death by any cause. Trans fats are. Trans fats are directly toxic to your mitochondria, to your cell membranes, everything. And so, yeah, marketing is just, I mean, on the other end of the spectrum, there's a lot of great food companies out there that are making really cool supplements, and I mean, I'm like friends with many producers, and I think it's really, really cool when you see a company step up and put something good out into the world, because so many companies are just like trying to make the quick buck.
Yeah, it's frustrating. It's tough. I've saw on your Instagram that you like carry olive oil with you to restaurants and stuff like that, and you use that like on sushi and things like that. It's awesome. Sometimes you gotta just take things in your own hands. What else, like when you started learning about this stuff, so you're in a prime position where you can make these changes. I mean, I've had the same problem with my parents, that I know like they're super unhealthy at times, and I'm trying to make changes and educate them. It can be frustrating, but I mean, there's a whole host of things that it's tough, I think, going through a lifetime of food choices to then on a flip of a coin, just snap of a finger, having to change everything. It's really challenging, I think, psychologically. Now that you've obviously started making some of these changes, like what were some of the big ones that you did after you started making research? Obviously, reducing processed foods and these vegetable oils, very easy to see from the surface. What about like key maybe micronutrients that you're looking for now, or maybe macronutrients and how you're approaching food in general? Like what has changed for you personally?
Yeah, I definitely, well, I mean, just from a lifestyle perspective, I definitely let go of the notion that I had to eat breakfast every single day.
Yeah, it's a big one.
Yeah. I mean, I think, we're still diurnal creatures, right? Like we're still meant to eat during the day. We're not mice. But the notion that you have to eat from the moment you wake up, I think is a fallacy. And I think it actually does us a lot of harm at the end of the day, because when you first wake up in the morning, your cortisol is at its peak. A lot of people think of cortisol as being this bad hormone in the body because of its relationship to stress, but cortisol is the body's chief catabolic hormone. And when you wake up in the morning, you're in the ultimate fat burning state. And too often what we do, especially in the standard American iteration of breakfast, we're reaching for rapidly digested carbs, the glass of orange juice, the granola, oatmeal, whatever. And essentially what you're doing in that early morning window when you're first waking up is you're causing insulin to be elevated at the same time as cortisol. These are 2 opposing hormones being elevated at the same time. That's bad news. You've got your body's chief catabolic hormone being elevated at the same time as your body's chief anabolic hormone.
Right.
So I like to skip eating breakfast. I don't eat until an hour or 2 or maybe even 3 sometimes after I wake up. Maybe in the morning I'll have some black coffee. And then, I try to build my diet around nutrient density. I adhere to a rule that I've created for myself and that I talk about, pretty frequently. I try to eat a huge fatty salad every single day. By fatty salad, I don't mean like the ranch dressing and the tortilla strips. Obviously I put a lot of extra virgin olive oil into my salad. And one of the, I think, most important things about doing this, I mean, there's a lot, when you consume dark leafy greens, you're getting a myriad of micronutrients that are really important. But I've become kind of interested lately in carotenoids, which are found in dark leafy greens. They're yellow and red plant pigments. You can't really see them in some vegetables because they're disguised by chlorophyll, but they're there. They're very apparent in like red kale, for example, that red color. They're also, interestingly, in high amounts in the egg yolks of pastured eggs, which is what gives those egg yolks like that really orange, that rich orange color. But carotenoids, so in vegetables, lutein and zeaxanthin in particular, have been shown to boost processing speed in young, healthy people by up to 20%. This was a University of Georgia study. And I think that's pretty cool because, we already kind of consider ourselves to be at peak performance when we're young.
Right.
But these are two nutrients that are pretty powerful antioxidants, but also seem to boost the way that your brain cells work. So I've definitely noticed that cognitively, I mean, since I've started eating my current diet, and it's all detailed in the book, but I've definitely noticed that my brain is way more like willing to fire on all cylinders on command.
And so this looks like, obviously in the book, if you want to read more details about that, but you have your fatty salad.
Yeah.
So you have a bunch of dark leafy greens. Like, what else do you put in there besides?
Yeah. So, it's all about the kinds of greens. So, I mean, kale is very important. Spinach is a top source of folate and magnesium. So I'm big on spinach, but then also arugula. Arugula is one of my favorite vegetables because it's the highest source of nitrate, which is really important for healthy vascular compliance. Maybe I'll throw some beets in there. Protein I think is very important. Again, protein is very satiating. It's also important when you're working out, as you should, to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. I think more protein is generally better within reason. I mean, still taking into account the overall, making sure that you're getting your micronutrients from plants and vegetables and things like that. That balance is key. I always try for some kind of a probiotic containing food, especially when I'm eating a salad. So if I'm eating a salad, I try to reach for a kombucha or something like that. When you consume probiotics with prebiotics, which is basically the soluble fiber in that dark leafy green concoction, by consuming a probiotic, which kombucha is rich in probiotic bacteria, with the greens, which provide the prebiotic bacteria, it's actually called symbiotic. And it's thought that by consuming both at the same time, you actually improve the potential staying power of those probiotics.
Right. So people can think of it like the gut bugs and the gut bug food, essentially.
Exactly.
So you're delivering new gut bacteria and you're giving it food at the same time.
Exactly. So, I mean, the gut-brain axis, I think, very important. Most probiotics flow through you, which is nonetheless still valuable. But in terms of their ability to take up domicile in the gut, it seems important to consume them with prebiotic fiber. So maybe I'll throw some kimchi in the salad or drink a bottle of kombucha. What else? I'm a big fan of broccoli sprouts.
Yeah.
I talk a lot about broccoli sprouts. I mean, cruciferous vegetables in general are pretty incredible, but broccoli sprouts, I've started growing my own, and they are a top source, or the top source rather, of sulforaphane when you chew the sprouts. And sulforaphane is a potent activator of the body's NRF2 pathway, which upregulates antioxidant production. Pretty powerful stuff. I mean, as a detox compound, broccoli sprouts are what's up. I think one pound of broccoli sprouts is the equivalent of 100 pounds of adult broccoli in terms of sulforaphane producing capacity.
Yeah, you basically just exactly described what I eat
Sick.
for lunch every day. Yeah. So it's usually arugula, spinach, kale, cabbage.
Nice.
Is the one I throw in there, and then some sauerkraut, oil, some nuts, and then maybe some like seed type of stuff, as well as broccoli sprouts or some type of sprout like that, and then like a fatty cut of meat.
Dude, sounds
pretty.
My mouth is watering. Yeah. I mean, it's important. Like researchers speculate that we consumed about 150 grams of fiber as hunter-gatherers, and today we consume about 15 grams on a good day. So what that's essentially doing is we're starving our gut bacteria. Mm-hmm. And they do so many good things for us. They produce butyrate, which is this short-chain fatty acid that's powerfully anti-inflammatory. And every time we eat, they wait in our large intestine patiently to be fed. And the way that we feed them is we eat prebiotic soluble sources of fiber.
So I want to get your point of view on what's becoming hot right now, which I'm going to try just because I think that everybody should be a guinea pig.
Yeah.
And I'm going to do blood work before and after and measure everything subjectively and objectively through this.
Cool.
But a carnivore diet, I'm going to go very, very high in organ meats to get as many micronutrients as possible. But basically eating fatty cuts of meat from a very good source. And that's it. So no vegetables, no fruit, no spices, nothing besides animal products. Just wondering your take on that, if you've seen that bubble up in your opinion.
Yeah, I've heard there's like one guy on Twitter who I think is a big advocate.
Yeah,
of
Sean
it.
Baker.
Yes, that guy.
Yeah.
I don't know him personally, but I've heard. That's hard for me to justify knowing what I know about the gut microbiome.
Right. So the hypothesis on that is that your gut microbiome is like what we know about it now is essentially from eating what we have been eating the last 10,000 years. That's what we know. But apparently if you start eating, for instance, 99, 100% meat, that it will shift in response to the nutrients that you are eating. And like it will be representative and just as healthy, if not healthier, subsisting on that. And so you'll have a change in your gut flora. Just like I think people, when they switch from carbohydrates to ketogenic diet, a lot of times have a huge shift. And so then you are, your microbiome is extracting different things out of that food. So that, and this is stuff like, I don't know. There's not enough evidence on it right now to really convince me. I'm skeptical of it in several different ways. But that's why I want to test to see how I respond to it exactly. I mean, I'm going to miss, like I was today just like savoring an avocado and like a tear was rolling down my face because like, I'm not going to be able to have this because all I can eat is meat. Like there's so much enjoyment out of food that I think is a huge reason why people are healthy because of like the cooking aspect and like the sharing meals. It's like, I think it's going to be tough from like a psychological standpoint, but I'll be interested to see like subjectively and objectively health outcomes from switching to that, since now there's like the wealth of anecdotal evidence.
Yeah.
But yeah, any other thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I remember looking at these incredible photographs that were published by the Sonnenberg lab at Stanford. Justin and Erica Sonnenberg are a husband and wife team. They're two of the most prominent microbiologists studying the microbiome. And I remember them doing this really cool experiment where they fed mice basically a prebiotic fiber deficient diet, and they compared it to mice fed lots of prebiotic fiber. And the difference in the mucosa, which basically keeps the bacteria in your large intestine separate from the enterocytes, which are basically the cells that line your large intestine, it shrank dramatically. It became like this anemic small thing. And this is because your gut bacteria basically consume fiber, they churn out butyrate, and goblet cells in your large intestine actually consume butyrate and in turn spit out mucin, which creates this mucosa. Right. That's how it works. And so this mucosa is really important. It's sort of like the hammock on which these gut bacteria live and hang out, and it keeps them sort of separate from our own adaptive immune system.
Right. And so like the thinner that gets and less mucus, what can happen is that foods you eat or even your own body can have responses to your immune system. That's where theoretically a lot of autoimmunity comes from. And so like, I know exactly the slide you're talking about, and like the really cool stain images, slides, like really, really cool. So like this is the reason we're like, okay, we'll see like how long would I have to be on it? Like these are the questions I'm trying to ask myself to get as much evidence as possible. But I mean, there's something to be said about like literally now thousands and thousands of people are getting changes from this diet. My hypothesis is it's more of a diet of omission than it is of exclusivity of animal protein or meat. So like people are probably just removing tons of stuff. So like when people go completely vegan, for example, after a standard American diet, they may feel way better.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that they're going to be an optimal, thriving human being without animal products. And so I think that might be a lot of the anecdotal success, even though Dr. Baker apparently was like full keto and then switched to a carnivore diet and has seen marked improvements for himself. It's kind of strange how he refuses to do blood work or release blood work on himself. Weird. So yeah, because he says that he knows what it would be. I mean, this is what he said, at least in the Joe Rogan podcast, which I listened to, but I haven't talked to him directly about it. But this is one of these things where, I'm not going to know on how my body responds to it until I start trying it. And so
you should have him on your podcast. I just don't understand what we would gain by removing things like spinach and arugula from our diet. That it doesn't pass muster for me.
Yeah, and so I think the hypothesis here is that plants, no matter of what source, have certain defense mechanisms built into them and nutrients that your body can deal will deal with in a negative aspect.
But some of those exact compounds are also some of the most beneficial,
right? And
aspects.
So from a hormonic standpoint, we're looking at, okay, how does your body, just like working out is technically a stressor, which you adapt to and become stronger. And so are we getting a hormonic stressor from these plants? I mean, probably. That's how vitamins and minerals work. They don't work largely in an additive aspect. It's more of a hormonic aspect, which is where the science is shifting now. And so this is where that may be a potential way to go down that route and explain that. And I guess just as a composition aspect. So if you look at, for instance, and I'm sure you probably highlight this in your book, but like DHA from salmon or animal sources, like your body can actually use, but from plant sources, it is maybe a 0% to 8% conversion rate or something like this. Like how many other nutrients are in fact, like we measure in vegetables or food, that we're just not getting. And so again, my hypothesis is that it's not like removing those would help, but like if people, for instance, eat more animal product where they can assimilate more of the nutrients, maybe they're just getting a higher nutrient density because they're thinking of reducing it in general. Like they're going to need to eat more nutrient dense food, which they actually assimilate more of. So maybe it's an assimilation adaptation.
It's super interesting. I mean, I'm definitely open-minded. You can get all of your essential nutrients from animal foods. You can't get all of your essential nutrients from plant foods.
And so that's where, like I said, I'm skeptical, but I can't draw a line in the sand if I don't do it myself. I feel like so. I just want to get your opinion if you've heard about wrestling.
Yeah, I mean, it's I mean, I can't wait to see how your experiment unfolds. And and I hope maybe more evidence will be done.
I mean, it's super fascinating. But this is where you start reading a lot of the research you've done and in your book. Like, I mean, there's these huge chapters on like why certain nutrients in certain plants are so vital. You know what I mean? And so there is, I think, a lot of work to be done. I just wanted to shift and ask you, like, obviously nutrition is huge, but this is one component of lifestyle. What else are you doing specifically on like a movement perspective to, like you said before, it's like it's important to go work out because you have all these different reasons. Like what is your approach to that? Like how have you noticed that change, for instance, brain health and the influence on that?
Definitely. Yeah. I've always had a bias towards weightlifting because I've always been terrible at sports and I don't like to run, but it turns out that building strong muscles is very important for just an overall health span. It becomes increasingly difficult to put on and maintain muscle as you age. So I think everybody, man, woman, boy, girl, working out, lifting weights, I think that's important. And there's a strong relationship between upper body and lower body strength and brain function and brain health. I mean, interestingly, the same stimulus that causes your muscles to grow works on your brain cells to make them more efficient. High intensity exercise stimulates AMPK, which is a really powerful, signaling pathway in the body that essentially creates new mitochondria, improves insulin sensitivity. These are all things that are attained by reaching a certain level of intensity in your workouts. And this is not through, I think it's like Mark Sisson who calls it chronic cardio.
Yeah, just jogging or
which I've never been
elliptical
into.
machines, stuff like that.
It's not. Yeah, I don't think that's certainly if you like it. I mean, certain people love to run, but I think it's more important to just move more throughout the day. Movement is really important, just in terms of mobilizing fluids in the body that don't have their own heart. For example, like our lymphatic system, we now know as of I think 3 years ago that it's directly connected to the brain via vessels previously considered not to exist. So, I mean, this is our body's waste disposal drainage system, and just moving around helps keep that debris circulating.
So it's like think about it as like a one-way valve for people who don't really know much about the lymphatic system, where the muscles kind of surround it, and the more you squeeze the muscles, the more you're going to pump that one-way valve of all the waste products from your tissue. So if you're not using all of your muscles in their full range of motion, you're essentially not getting that full pumping and that full clearance of metabolites. So then you get stuff that becomes very inflammatory because you're being sedentary and you're not pumping that waste product around your body.
Boom. There you go. Yeah, so important. Yeah. So exercise, it's the level of evidence right now for exercise as a therapeutic and as just a means of improving the way that you learn and retain information. I mean, it's pretty astounding. There's good research on college age students in Japan that they were being taught a new language and they were told to exercise on a stationary bicycle while they were learning it. And I believe it was 6 months later, they actually had retained the information they had learned better than the control group who just learned it at a static sitting desk. At the other end of the age spectrum, the guidelines for treatment for mild cognitive impairment, which is often considered pre-dementia, were literally just updated where a physician now should actually write exercise on a prescription pad if you're suffering from MCI.
Yeah.
It's just, it just coats your brain in a cocktail of powerful chemicals. I mean, BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, is upregulated powerfully when we exercise. Exercise is the best way to actually improve the brain supply of BDNF, which is, it's been called by John Ratey, or Ratey, I never know how to pronounce his name, a sort of miracle grow protein for the brain. And patients with Alzheimer's disease, and even depression, actually, BDNF is reduced. So improving the plasticity of our brain's ability to forge new connections and rewire itself, so to speak, I think is really powerful, and exercise is the best way to do that.
It's amazing. What do you do for stress reduction? You seem like a pretty easygoing guy, though. You don't need much.
Yeah, I'm pretty. I mean, that's I've always been a pretty easygoing guy, despite the fact that I'm from New York, which maybe my easygoingness is a response to the fact that I'm a New Yorker. I just don't want to be like a typical New Yorker, but I do love to exercise. It's a major, passion of mine. I also, I like to play music. I taught myself how to play guitar. And so that's a big, stress relieving activity for me. It's also really good for the brain, learning to play a musical instrument. I like to, I'm kind of obsessed with saunas. Big fan of saunas, just based on all the latest research that's coming out.
Just traditional heat, infrared, any type of specific sauna that you...
I like it all. I don't really like steam rooms, actually.
Yeah, I'm the same way.
Yeah.
Too much, man.
Too much, and I find it hard to breathe. Yeah. It's not fun.
And like if you look at temperature from what you get out of a sauna and dry heat, you can just tolerate way more. Whereas the steam room, it's like it feels so damn hot. Like I need to like crawl out of a hot steam room, and an instant, but I can be like a 200-degree sauna and like chill in there for 30 minutes, 40 minutes.
Yeah, I love it. It's freaking great. It's a great way to. There was a good study that I shared on Twitter. We accumulate flame retardants from the environment, and sweating. They found that just sitting in a sauna and sweating it out, it's a really great way to get rid of them, to purge them.
Amazing. How do you sleep in New York?
I sleep really well, actually. I'm a good sleeper. And there are things that I know that I can do to improve my sleep hygiene. My bedroom in New York is not very dark. It should be very dark.
Do you do eye mask or anything like that? Or
I need to get one. Yeah, I don't know.
I'll get you one.
Yeah, I need an eye mask.
It's my like number one sleep solution.
Really?
Yeah, eye mask, 100%.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome. There's really interesting research coming out showing how just low level light, like about 10 lux, can actually, it's linked with depression in older adults. There was a study I literally just shared on Twitter, but also that just being exposed to low level light for one night actually impacts your cognitive function the next day, which is, fascinating to me. I don't fully understand the mechanism because you're sleeping, but.
So I think that you have some photoreceptors in your skin and like in your ear and things like that can like be detrimental towards your restfulness in your sleep. So then you're not recovering as much, I assume, and then you're just not getting as deep of sleep. So I use an Oura ring. I don't know if you know this thing. And I was tracking sleep, and I didn't find much of a difference if I did full blackout curtains versus just an eye mask for me. But I also sleep with covers on and stuff like that. So like I don't have much skin exposed. So that probably depends. Like if you're sleeping naked with no sheets or something like that, it probably matters more than if you have clothes on and you're sleeping with sheets over yourself. But like I track myself didn't notice much of a difference. What I did notice though is if I had like even one glass of wine at all, like with dinner a couple hours before, my sleep was markedly worse.
Wow.
Tremendously worse every time.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Also, some other like sleep stuff like magnesium, great increase in sleep quality.
Cool.
Non-psychoactive CBD was known as like it's a very sleep inducing thing. Ruined my sleep every time.
Ruined it. Wow.
Yeah. So it helped me get to sleep faster, I found, but the depth of my sleep was like much less restful. And so I didn't hit all the levels of sleep that I needed to anytime that I had any level of CBD in it. So this is not like you're not gonna get high on this stuff. This is stuff that's like becoming very popular. It's like a relaxing type of a compound. But I noticed that my sleep was actually markedly worse every time that I used it before bed.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's again, N of 1, who knows?
Interesting.
Yeah, but I mean, just getting data like that on yourself, I think is super important.
Super important. Sleep is so important.
Cool, man. Well, don't want to take up too much of your time, and like thank you for dedicating your life to this stuff, man. I know like how much work it takes to research all this stuff, and just love it. Book should be popping by the time this podcast is out. So if you want to mention where people can grab that and where they can find you.
Yeah, well, Genius Foods is available anywhere books are sold. You can go to geniusfoodsbook.com to get some cool pre-order bonuses. But it's going to be out everywhere books are sold. Amazon, Barnes & Noble. Come say hi to me on Instagram at Max Lugavere, Twitter at Max Lugavere. And yeah, just enjoy Genius Foods. Take it, and I really wrote it to be sort of a treasure trove of information. It's like the best research on dementia prevention, nutritional psychiatry, cognitive optimization. My hope is that it really stands the test of time as a sort of fun to read owner's manual for your brain.
Yeah, love it, man. Appreciate it.
Dude. Thank you.
All right, everyone. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Keto Answers podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, but even if you didn't, I would love a review. Just go over to iTunes, wherever you listen to your podcasts, and pop in a review so we can get found by more people, get better guests, and have the information that you need. So please go to iTunes, wherever you listen to your podcasts, and leave us a review. And if you're new to keto, head on over to perfectketo.com/podcast and enter your email for all our top tips and guides on getting started with the ketogenic diet. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.